All right. All right, let's get started here. Lots to do, lots to do. The tiny desk strikes again. All right. So obviously today, a couple of things to kind of get out of the way. First one is obviously we have about 7 slides worth of content still to go through. Want to make sure we do that. Then we can do some Q&A, and I can show you some of the practice questions and just kind of talk you through them. They're very similar to what you had on the first exam, and you all did pretty well on that. So I don't think anything should concern people too much, but I'll talk about that. I'll get through the content first, and we can talk about the exam after that. And I promise I will do this as quickly as possible so that we do have time. Okay. So, all right, so we were talking about Stark's book, The Rise of Christianity, last time, and we sort of ended off, we finished the section on, what did we finish the section on? All right, the mission to the Jews and why it probably succeeded. So the last little section in Stark's book basically deals with the martyrs, right? And why Stark actually thinks, the martyrs, right, the people who died for their faith, probably helped Christianity in the early stages. And while we might not think of, getting eaten by a lion or crucified upside down or whatever as a particularly rational thing to do, Stark actually thinks it makes, a lot of rational sense in terms of early Christianity and probably played a big role in its rise. Okay, so basically, we know that martyrs, right, and martyrology was an important part of early Christianity, right? Because it was a movement that was not in power and not favored by the Roman state, it often came into conflict. Now, as I've said before, the persecutions of Christianity were sporadic, right? It wasn't constant. It sort of came and went, right? And at particular moments, it got worse. Especially if the state needed a scapegoat, as was the case after the Great Fire of Rome in the mid-60s AD with Nero, right? Nero blamed the Christians for setting the fires and executed a number of prominent Christians, including both Peter and Paul, who were both executed in Rome. Okay, so Peter by being crucified upside down and Paul by beheading, because Paul was a Roman citizen, and you get the less horrible way to die if you're a Roman citizen. Okay, so what Stark says, and I mean, if you remember this idea of rational choice theory from earlier in the course, right, when I presented Stark's ideas, right, he said that people with little to gain tend to make really strong impressions on people about the value of their religions, right? Now, for Stark, people who are, potentially willing to die for their faith end up being a really powerful testimony, especially in the ancient world, right? Because their deaths would have been deeply impressive, right? Because they were willing to go to their deaths for what they believed, and because really they seem to have nothing to gain from it, right? If you're being put to death by the Roman state, you don't have a lot to gain, right? You're not getting rich, you're not getting powerful, you're just dying. Okay, there's been lots of kind of people who've tried to psychoanalyze, the martyrs. Stark cites this critic Reich from 1976, who concluded that, Christianity included a sort of masochism and a love of suffering and death. And I mean, this has been kind of popular since then. What's his name? Christopher Hitchens picks this up in his discussion of Mother Teresa and all of these sorts of things that basically Christians just love pain. I don't know that that's true, but that's certainly an argument that's been made. But what Stark says is that even, radical sacrifice and the stigmas that Christians faced. And there were a lot of stigmas, right? Christians, because they weren't pagans, they refused to burn that pinch of incense to Caesar as a god, right? Would have been excluded from some high social positions and probably had some negative consequences socially. So this cat is Saint Polycarp, being burned at the burned. I don't know. Yeah, I guess there's a stake there. He's being burned at the stake in the Colosseum. Polycarp was supposedly a follower of the Apostle John, right? So anyway, that's not important. Also, I mean, pretty ripped, I gotta say. Maybe it's just the art. I'm like, man, Christianity is good for the abs, apparently. Maybe it's all that kneeling. I don't know. Okay, so what Stark says, martyrs were, very credible exponents because they voluntarily accepted martyrdom. And right, like I said, some of them, like Polycarp, begged people not to intervene on their behalf because they wanted to be martyred. And they had a very easy way out, right? And many Christians actually did take this way out, which was, if you were arrested and put on trial, if you burned that pinch of incense to Caesar, honestly, this is how easy it was, right? Just ceremonially take a little bit of incense, throw it in the fire, in honor of Caesar, and they'll let you go, right? It's a denunciation of your faith because you're accepting that Caesar too is a god, just like the god of the Jews. But it was not exactly that difficult, right? If you didn't want to die, all you had to do, burn that pinch of incense. So some did, right? And they were widely denounced. And after Christianity becomes one of the official religions of the Roman Empire, there's a lot of hard work that went into, like, what do we do with these people who denounce the faith? Can we allow them back in? Or are they, as they say in Latin, anathema set, eternally accursed? Latin's so fun. You could say eternally accursed, or you could say anathema set. It's much more fun. Okay, so some did, right? Those who didn't, right? Those who went to their deaths were revered as martyrs, right? And Christianity has this long tradition of Christian martyrs, most of whom now, like especially in Catholicism, but in Eastern Orthodoxy and some older forms of Protestantism, like Anglicanism, are revered as saints, right? Anyway. Well, I won't explain Catholic theology around saints, but they were revered. Okay, so one of the things that Stark says, and where this kind of radical sacrifice probably helped Christians a lot, was in addressing what's called the free rider problem. All right, I'm going to play this little clip from The Simpsons to illustrate what a free rider is. Homer Simpson's a free rider in this clip.
What do you mean by suggested donation?
Pay any amount you wish, sir.
And what if I wish to pay $0?
Well, it's up to you.
Ooh, so it's up to me, is it?
Yes.
I see. And you think that people are going to pay you $4.50 even though they don't have to? Just out of the goodness of their... Well, anything you say. Good luck, lady. You're gonna need it.
Mr. Bergstrom!
Hi, Lisa.
Hey, you don't have to pay. Read the sign.
And this must be your father.
Right. So free riders. What are free riders, right? Well, basically, what Stark says, and this is true, right? And you see this problem in all sorts of literature, like when I've taught sociology of work and industry, right? Free riders are a huge problem for things like unions and any kind of collective action. So what are they? Basically, they're people who attach themselves to organizations that offer some kind of benefit, and they take the benefit, but they put in nothing, right? So this is a big problem for religions, right? And this is something Stark talks about in terms of groups like the Moonies, right? The Moonies had a big free rider problem at their kind of beginning in the United States because they offered things like, you could stay for free in a room and they would feed you, and there were attractive female members so you could woo them and potentially have sex with them. And this attracted for a while a lot of people who contributed nothing to the movement, but ultimately were just kind of there sucking up resources. And any kind of collective action will end up with free riders, right? People who contribute nothing to, say, a union or a religious group, but take up resources. Now, this ends up being a problem for groups in major ways, right? Because one of the reasons to belong to any group from a kind of rational perspective is that it offers you some kind of benefit, right? You get something out of it, whether it's relationships or material benefits, right? Money, food, lodging, help, assistance, help moving, something, right? So, when there's too many free riders, they just soak up all the benefits, and then there's not enough to distribute, to other people, especially those people who are putting in resources. And people get disaffected and kind of frustrated. Okay, so what Stark contends is that Christianity sort of avoided in its early years the free rider problem by demanding a ton out of its members, right? 10% of income, this comes from Judaism, right? This idea that, a tenth of the ephod of grain should be given to the temple, right? So out of I think it's out of Samuel, first or second Samuel, I can't remember which one. 10% of your resources should go to, the church. So this gets carried over into Christianity. So people are supposed to give a tenth of their income, but also do things like care for the poor, the sick, the widowed, right? Things that soak up resources. So it demands a lot of these things. In ancient Rome, it also involves a lot of social stigma, right? If you are a Christian, you're kind of socially deviant up until Constantine makes it a tolerated religion, right? So for the first few centuries of its existence, it's not a social benefit to you to be a Christian, it's a social detriment. So again, that's going to push away a lot of free riders, because immediately, right, if you're not a pagan, if you're one of these weird Christian people, that is going to be a social detriment to you. You're going to forego opportunities. You might have to give up wealth or, in material or human kind of opportunities, all these sorts of things, because you're part of this religion. It involves making a lot of sacrifices. However, what Stark says is by demanding higher levels of stigma and sacrifice, religious groups can induce higher than average levels of member commitment and participation. They do, basically, you have to give up a lot, but if there's a lot of benefit and people are forced to give up a lot, that makes religious communities that, relative to their size, have a lot of resources, right? They have a lot that they can offer people. And this basically makes it possible for them to be incredibly attractive, right? And so, by demanding, these high levels of kind of stigma and sacrifice, especially financial and in terms of effort, they're able to generate a lot of material, social, and religious benefits. So what Stark says is, well, it might be counterintuitive in some senses. Often membership in an expensive religion is a good bargain, because while you're giving up a lot, you're also benefiting more than you would on the outside, right? You're getting a lot of things that you wouldn't have access to, especially, community and material benefits of all sorts. He thinks this was definitely the case for early Christianity, because it was so unattractive to kind of the marginal, like people who might want to be marginally affiliated. It means that it produced a lot of those kinds of benefits. All right. No, I don't want to watch the Simpsons clip again. Okay. So another thing that Stark thinks probably helped early Christianity. One of the typical problems of a new religious movement is that, often, and I think Christianity kind of no different here, a lot of them are sort of apocalyptic in their sort of vision, right? They expect an end to the world that's going to be relatively soon, right? And this is definitely the case, right? With Christianity, the early Christians believed that they were in the end times, right? The eschaton, if you want to use the Greek. And that basically Jesus would be returning soon, right? And we would bring along the end of the world, right? Now, one of the things that often happens in new religious movements that have this sort of apocalyptic focus is that when this doesn't happen, right, as it hasn't in Christianity, obviously we're still all here, there's been no moon turning blood red and 4 horsemen or any of that jazz. That's all in Revelation. So there's been none of that, right? No 12 scrolls and 12 trumpets or any of that fun symbology that's in Revelation. what happens often about 30, 40 years after the founding of a new religious movement is the original members start to realize that what they were expecting to happen isn't happening, and they get discouraged. And often then you start to see people peel off. So, for instance, this happens with the Mormons, right? The Mormons survive it. What happens about 30, 40 years after the founding of Mormonism by Joseph Smith is that a lot of the original converts actually do leave, right? They got disaffected. They realized that, some of the promises of Mormonism were incorrect, and they just kind of leave. So most new religious movements kind of peter out after 30, 40 years. The original members get disaffected. They were the driving force, and then there's no one to pick it up afterwards. And so, as that first generation of Christians start to die, and be martyred, the fact that Jesus hasn't come back yet becomes a theological problem. Now, what Stark thinks prevents this from kind of derailing Christianity in its early days is the fact that the really prominent early members of the church, and basically, like, if you look at Catholic and Orthodox sort of histories, they'll say that all of the original 12 apostles of Jesus are all martyred in different places in the world. I can't remember where all of them end up being martyred, but there's a whole list, except for John, who ends up on the island of some island off of Anatolia. I can't remember the name of it now. Patmos. John of Patmos is Patmos. Anyway, not important, but slightly. But the kind of main leaders of the church, James, so the brother of Jesus, is killed in Jerusalem in 63, right? Basically, there's a brief kind of lapse in Roman rule, and the Jewish authorities drag him outside the city gates and stone him to death. So James dies in 63. And then Peter and Paul, Paul is beheaded in 64 or 65, we're not exactly sure. And Peter is crucified upside down in 66, 67. So the first generation all kind of died for the faith, right? So they end up offering a testimony about the truth of Christianity. And then those following generations of Christians sort of refigure, they look back on what Jesus said and on things, and they write books like Revelation, which is written about 120 CE, roughly, I think, if I remember the dates right. So, quite a bit after this, kind of trying to think of, okay, Jesus hasn't come back yet. What does this mean? Can we still be Christian? Was it all a lie? And they sort of refigure the whole story and create theology around it, right? But because that original generation didn't get bored and leave, they actually were killed for the faith. It protects Christianity from this fate. And to an extent, right, Mormonism does this as well, right? If Joseph Smith had lived, to his ripe old age, there's a real chance that Mormonism would never have gone off the ground, because people have been like, okay, Joseph made a whole bunch of promises and they haven't come true. Let's all just quit and leave. But Joseph Smith is killed basically in a gunfight in, I can't remember, I want to say it's like Ohio or Illinois or something. At trying to escape from prison, he ends up getting killed. Joseph Smith was always in legal trouble. Amongst other things, he liked to sleep with other people's wives and then say they were his wives. So he got into a whole bunch of trouble. And anyway, let's not talk about Joseph Smith. I don't know if there's any Mormons in the class. I don't want to say anything insulting. But yeah, he was always in legal trouble. He ends up dying in a sort of Wild West type gunfight. And the fact that he's dead allows Brigham Young to then kind of move the Mormons into Utah, set up, Salt Lake City, and create a theology around, Joseph Smith as the prophet and all of this kind of stuff. So this is common for new religious movements. It's better in a lot of cases if the founder dies and if the early followers die in this kind of martyred way, because if they hang around for too long, they get disaffected and then they leave. And it's only because Brigham Young sort of sticks around that Mormonism survives. And Stark thinks it's only because, Peter, Paul, and James die, and then a lot of the other early Christians die, martyred, not get bored and leave, that Christianity actually survives. Okay. So, some final remarks. I can do this. On the rise of Christianity. Okay, so one of the things that Stark says is new religious movements, right, generally don't control whether they succeed or fail. But there's a couple of things that kind of help The degree of state regulation, where the state is willing to vigorously persecute challengers to traditional faiths, new religious movements struggle. And in this case, the Roman Empire was pretty lax. It's a pretty lax religious system. There's sporadic persecution of Christians, but mostly they're kind of left to their own devices and only pops up now and then, just enough to create these martyrs that give them sort of that testimonial fuel to keep it going. But the Roman Empire is actually a pretty open religious system. There's lots of competing religions, right? There are the Roman gods, there's Cybele from Egypt, there's Mithraism that pops up a little bit after Christianity. Lots and lots of kind of similar, like religious movements popping up. And the state is pretty tolerant of them in general. So that is a place where new religious movements can thrive. One of the reasons we don't get a ton of really gerbil new religious movements out of, say, continental Europe is because they do vigorously persecute a lot of new religions. But say in America, especially kind of the western part of America where Mormonism sort of takes its root, not a lot of persecution, right? The state is pretty tolerant for the most part of new religious movements. The other one is the vigor of conventional religious organizations, right? If there's no market niche to fill, it's going to be hard for new religious movements to take hold, like if the market's saturated. So one of the things that Stark says is that, in the late Roman Empire, paganism was sort of exhausted in lots of ways, right? Religions will tend to run their course a lot of the time. They need to be revitalized, and paganism had just kind of run aground. So you were getting the growth of the cult of Cybele, the cult of Mithra, and Christianity all kind of at the same time, because that kind of Greco-Roman system was a little bit exhausted. The same thing with Mormonism, in the American West. Some of the established mainline Protestant churches, Anglicanism, Congregationalism, Presbyterianism, were all a little bit tired, right? They'd become very worldly and institutionalized, and they weren't appealing to people, so something like Mormonism can spring up. The next unit after the midterm, we'll talk about Stark and I think it's Bainbridge's account of what they call the churching of America, which is a really interesting one. And we'll talk a little bit more about America. Yeah, Mia. Yeah, so basically what Stark suggests is that, as religions get established, they become very institutionalized. They become more concerned with kind of worldly things, right? Like offering, like social justice or running their bureaucracy or making sure that their clergy are well educated and have pensions and are well paid and are professionalized and these sorts of things. And what Stark says is basically they get kind of low energy, right? They lose some of their vigor if they don't somehow get revitalized, right? They need to be sort of boosted up at certain points by reinvigorizing movements, or people will just kind of lose interest. And I'll give you a preview. One of the things that Stark says is that actually when we get to the founding of America in 1776, church attendance and actual kind of membership in churches is really low in America. It's going through this kind of low ebb moment. It's kind of a riff on this myth of past piety that we've already talked about. Basically, they get tired, they get worldly, they get kind of boring, and people tune out. And it's only if and that gives space for either, sects, like in Christianity, there's a lot of sects that come along. The Methodists, the Baptists, the Pentecostals, right, all kind of pop up to fill that niche within Christianity. And sort of, anyway, I'll talk about that later. There's forms of Catholicism that pop up this way too. What was I saying? I got distracted by my own thinking. This happens a lot. It's after Halloween too. There were 7 teenagers, 3 middle schoolers, or late elementary schoolers, and 3 preschoolers at my house last night going trick-or-treating, and my brain is completely not working. Anyway, so yeah, it's only where they have that opens up a niche, right? Basically that exhaustion of existing religions sort of opens up a space for either sects or new religious movements to come in and reinvigorate the religious environment if it's a relatively open market. Did I answer your question? Okay, perfect. All right. Right, so what Stark contends is that paganism was so exhausted, right? The Greco-Roman kind of religious system was so exhausted that the second Constantine shifts the state's support to Christianity, it all starts to fall apart, right? Paganism had been, and the pagan temple system had all been sort of state funded. People weren't giving of their own resources to these institutions. And the second it's cut away, right, basically paganism starts to collapse, right? And by the time we reach the middle part of the 5th century, right, most of the pagan temples are now empty, right? The priests have disappeared. There's some level of kind of belief amongst the paganus, right, the peasants, but basically that whole system sort of fell away and almost no one cared. So, according to Stark, Christianity didn't destroy paganism. It just sort of moved into the space that its weakness opened up, right? In this marketplace of religious ideas, Christianity had a really appealing set of ideas, and it moved into this space where paganism was no longer filling that niche. The Roman Empire, there was too much pluralism, and therefore none of the pagan sects and cults was very strong, which allowed this very unified and very vigorous religion to just sort of sweep it all away. Okay, so conclusions to the book, right? So the last slide for content for the midterm. Christianity, according to Stark, didn't grow because of miracle working in the marketplace, right? No mass conversions or they're healing people. So people are like, oh, miracles, and joined. Or because of Constantine, because Constantine made it the official religion. Or even totally because the martyrs gave it credibility. It grew because it was an intense religious community that was able to hold together against external forces and offered a ton of rewards to people who joined, right? Whether they were women or poor people or, whoever, right? It offered a ton. Widows, right? Whoever they were, they got a lot of benefit out of being Christian, even if they were giving up things in society. So, its primary means of growth was through united, motivated efforts, right? Growing the number of Christians through social bonds, right? Through connections, through inviting people, through helping them, through, caring for them when they were plague struck, all of these sorts of things. Right? So they invited their friends, their relatives, their neighbors, their husbands, their slaves to join in and hear, the good news of Christianity. And that's how Christianity grew, ultimately through these kinds of tight social bonds and spreading through these social networks. And he thinks that's the story of new religious movements in general. All right. Okay. That is it for the content. Huzzah, we made it. I'm just going to turn a Q&A slide on here. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hands. Do a quick Q&A, and then I can show you a couple of questions quickly before we, kind of break. So we can use the rest of the time. If you have any questions about content or about the midterm, fire away.
I have a question about secularization
Okay.
theory. So Stark says that we were wrong, or historians were wrong about how religious Europe was.
Right.
But then he also says that people just weren't Christian, but they were doing home worship.
Well, he says more today, in Europe, we don't see as much kind of churched religion, but there's still a lot of in-home religion or spirituality. And the point he's making is when we try to measure secularization by church attendance in Europe, we're missing the forest from the trees, because we're missing the fact that church attendance was never really that high, right? But that doesn't mean that what has kind of moved into that space is people being atheist, agnostic, or even none. The people who are there, right, still have supernatural beliefs. They just aren't the ones that we would measure on a traditional kind of social science census, being like, are you Catholic? Great. Do you go to church, right? It would miss all of those people who are at home, lighting candles and looking at their horoscope.
But wasn't there still those people in early Europe, the pagans, doing the land-based worship? So
it just doesn't necessarily get captured, because one of the ways we've traditionally measured religiosity is through church attendance, right? And so he's basically arguing against people like Bruce that just flat church attendance shouldn't be taken and that it's low shouldn't be taken as a measure of secularism, because there's a lot of things underneath the surface that we don't see if we just measure by church attendance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So, what exactly are the topics where we need to come with our own example?
Okay. So, all the theories of secularization, of which there are 5. So, well, okay. So there's, well, let's say there's technically 6. So there's the inherited model of secularization, kind of the, I would say, the revised inherited model of Bruce, right? Religion as alien, right? No secularization or zero secularization from Stark. Neo-secularization from Mark Chavez. And then we've got self-limiting secularization from Stark and Bainbridge. And then post-secularization from Habermas. Now, yeah, those are the 6. You should think of examples of each of them. Post-secularization would be the one I would say don't worry as much about because we spent like 1 slide on it. But all the other 5, definitely think of, you know, some example that you could cite that points to any of these theories or kind of what each of the thinkers is talking about. When it comes to the rise of Christianity, I don't think there are any questions like that. They're mostly content questions and sort of explain, you know, what does he think and why? What evidence does he cite? You know, so like when he talks about women in the church, right? How women drove the growth of Christianity. Okay, what's his argument and what evidence does he cite? There's a lot of those kinds of questions. So I have a good grasp on all of that stuff. Trying to think. There might be, it's not a case study question, but there might be a sort of like imaginative exercise question that you might get. Like what could a new religious movement learn from the rise of Christianity? You know, I won't say too much more about that, but something like that. Other question? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so basically the secularization science where we need to think of our own examples.
Yes. Yeah. Something I didn't talk about.
Oh.
Other questions? You're all making this too easy on me. You're all too tired. So many more of you showed up today than usual. You must have questions. I'm not ragging on you. I'm just being silly. A question. Interesting question. Right. So yeah, in the context of late antiquity, she's not walking out on me. She's auditing the course, not actually taking the exam. So this doesn't apply to her. So social being Christian in late antiquity, right, in the waning days of the Roman Empire prior to Constantine, is definitely a social deviance, right, because you're rejecting the whole Greco-Roman pagan system. But it's all of those things that Christian communities offer to people, right? Greater rights for women, right? Protection against things like abortion, again, and again, abortion in this context, being very different from how we think of it, would have been seen as a social, like a negative for women, because there was a really good chance, their husbands were the ones that controlled it. It's like, oh, you're pregnant? Well, let's get you that abortion right now, and you have no choice. And it was dangerous, right? Infection and death through poisoning were common occurrences when people attempted to induce abortions. Female infanticide, infidelity, all of these things, there's a sort of protection that Christianity offered to women who were Christian, right? Because Christianity didn't allow for any of these things, right? You would have been ostracized from the community. So if you were Christian, and then like if your husband left you or died, there was support for you as a widow. The community would actually feed you, clothe you, and support you either until you got remarried or potentially until you yourself passed away, right? It offers a lot of benefits like that. If you got sick, there were people to care for you, right? They took care of the poor, to the point where post-Constantine, there's another Roman emperor who's not so warm on Christianity. He was called Julian the Apostate. And he's called the Apostate because he was baptized as a Christian and then later rejected it and turned back to paganism, right? So he apostatized Christianity. And he complains vocally that, the Christian, and he tries to get the pagan temples to like take care of people the way Christians do. And he complains that these stupid Christians are not only taking care of our poor, or they're poor, they're also taking care of our poor and sick. And so they're very attractive because they're so socially active, right? So Christianity offers a lot of those kinds of benefits. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. A thumbs up, maybe. I don't know. I'll answer this question and then. I will have to look that one up because can you remind me what it is? Because I can see the slide, but I can't read it in my brain. And I don't remember what the second assumption was. If you could just type it into the slide. I can't remember. Type it into the slide and I'll answer that question. Okay. Can I re-explain what Stark said about the early martyred Christians and how it relates to disaffectedness? Okay, so I mean, the early Christian martyrs, right, would have served as a powerful testimony that they really, really believed this thing, that they really thought there were the benefits, right, that they would go to heaven, they would see their relatives, that they'd be in peace forever with Jesus, hallelujah, hallelujah, and that there was a lot of disaffectedness kind of in the pagan system, right? The pagan system's kind of falling apart. Its explanations don't seem like they are working as well. And so, there's a lot of space for Christianity to kind of move in, and that kind of disaffectedness, leaves a lot of people disattached from paganism. And those early martyrs are like, a super duper infomercial where they interview Carla, who used to be 800 pounds, and now she's a trim 120, right? You've all seen that infomercial, right? The martyrs are kind of that, right? It's like, I used to be spiritually lost, and now I'm spiritually found. And this is how sure I am of it, that I'm willing to go to my death, right? So it's the testimonials that are important there. Okay. Okay, so, yeah, so Stark's point number 2. Basically, I keep bumping the stupid screen. I wish they'd move this desk like a foot forward. Stark's point here is basically that what he's saying, and he's aiming this at people like Chavez a little bit, is that secularization theories, he thinks, don't just deal with institutional differentiation, but also with individual kind of belief, right? Piety, belief. Because basically what Chavez does in his piece, the one that I cited, right, which, keep in mind, was written about 4 years before Stark wrote Secularization Rip, is that he's like, okay, yeah, we got this thing wrong, inherited secularization theory didn't work out. So we're going to talk about secularization as a decline in religious authority, not necessarily a decline in individual belief. And what Stark is saying is, Mark, stop moving the goalposts, right? If you're going to stop trying to fix secularization theory by toning it down and saying it's just about, institutional differentiation, where the church is now just one institution amongst many, because what you actually do believe, and you kind of see it in Chavez's kind of take on micro-secularization, is that secularization also involves people believing less, right? And Stark's like, you lost. Religion's still around. People still have religious beliefs. Even if they're not in church, if they believe in God or karma or, the great hereafter, the happy hunting ground, whatever it happens to be that they believe, that's still spiritual beliefs. It's still on an individual level. People still believe. So, I'm sorry, Mark. I'm sorry, Steve. Your theories are wrong, and your attempts to revise secularization to make it, fit the awkward fact that you're wrong needs to stop. Hopefully that answers that. Yeah, Jessica.
Steve versus religion as alien. That was kind of the concept that as we progress in society, there is less religious knowledge.
So that's one of his points, right? So his whole thing is, right, okay, we didn't get secularization like we thought. It happened much later than we were expecting, right? So like, say in Britain, we didn't see it until the middle part of the 20th century. But once it kicks in, it declines about 50% per generation, right? So every generation is about half as religious as the last one. And what's going to drive it is things like, and what makes it sort of irreversible is declining stocks of knowledge, right? So people don't know much about religion anymore. It's not part of the cultural kind of knowledge like it was in the past. They don't know people who are religious. I'm trying to remember all the points. Religion is othered, right? So it's alien, it's othered. It has a bad public reputation. And there's one that I'm forgetting, but I'm sure it's in your notes somewhere.
I think it's once the decline sets in, it can't be reversed.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Mia.
still like religious or?
Yes. I will. All right, I'll take Mia's question and then I'll go to the practice questions. Yeah, so basically he disagrees with that because he cites this study that was done, I think, in 1914 and then in 1997. I can't remember the exact dates. I'm sorry. And he says basically, when it comes to scientists in the physical sciences, we've seen over almost a century no major decline in kind of religious beliefs. The numbers are basically the same, right? There's some scientists that, I think it's about 38% that still believe in a personal God that you can pray to and expect an answer. There's some that don't believe and there's some that aren't sure. But those numbers haven't fundamentally changed in a century. And he's like, if science is deadly to religion, we should ultimately see, scientists, the most involved in science, declining in religiosity first, right? And since that hasn't happened, he basically says, that obviously science in and of itself, isn't toxic to belief, right? Okay. Practice questions. We got 10 minutes. I can do it. I have power. Oh. All right. Oh, Bing headlines. That food looks good. Okay. Let's go to E-class. Tika. Oop, wrong login. I have too many CCIDs. Don't tell anyone. I collect them. Okay. What is it? Blah, 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 blah. I swear to God, I hate Halloween more than anything in the entire universe. Okay. So this is a rise of Christianity question. Written in such a way, by the way, that ChatGPT has no idea what I'm talking about, which is awesome. I have to be very clever now, especially with open book exams. I put this through ChatGPT and it came out with garbled gibberish, which was awesome. It's English, but it doesn't make any sense. So, what have sociologists long assumed about the class makeup of religious people, right? All right, this, you should immediately hear deprivation theory, right? So here you would be like, for 5 marks, you'd be like, sociologists following Uncle Carl, my buddy with the big beard, I hate him. Uncle Carl, or Karl Marx, right, have often assumed that religion is most appealing to poor people, right? To people who have the least amount of social resources. How does Stark problematize these assumptions? All right, so you can go straight to Rise of Christianity. I gotta stop walking in front of that projector. It blinds me for a second every time. That the early makeup of Christians actually was considerably middle class, right? That it was actually more appealing to middle class people. And Stark problematizes it by saying, okay, it was early Christians, we know, right? We have evidence from all over the New Testament that has a sort of middle class bias, right? That Paul is being supported by these relatively wealthy Roman women. So it has a kind of middle class bias. And as I've said, we often see new religious movements coming not from the lower echelon of society, but actually, the founders of religions and new religious movements and sects are often middle class, right? So you can point here to the Buddha, right, who was a prince. You can point to, Stark does a little jujitsu because he thinks that Jesus was probably also middle class, despite Christianity always depicting him as poor. Stark thinks he was middle class because he could read and write, which kind of makes sense. But you could point to Muhammad, right? Muhammad was a wealthy merchant. Many of the, St. Francis of Assisi was a nobleman when he founded the Franciscan order in Roman Catholicism. You could point to Catherine. Anyway, you could point to a million examples, right? And that's what you want to do for this question, is be like, that's what he's saying, is right. Actually, religion is more appealing to the middle class because they actually have the time to think about it once they're wealthy, right? They're not worried about feeding each other, so they can think of greater metaphysical questions. All right, does that make sense? Are we okay with that? Any questions before I jump to question 2? All right, you had your chance. Yes. You could get a question just like this. All right, so you are the leader of the Movementarians, a new religious movement. You take SOS 376 from Professor Broussard. What lessons could you take from the course that would make the movementarians more likely to succeed? List at least 2 insights and why each of them would be helpful. This you could go a million directions with, right? But you should be thinking about the rise. This is another rise of Christianity kind of question, right? So what does Stark think, without me like narrating everything, what does Stark think made Christianity successful, right? So let's put one that you probably shouldn't put. You could kill yourself, right? Or die, and make sure all of your early believers die. That's probably not actually good advice. So don't put that. But like, what are the other things, right? What made Christianity successful, right? And like you can think of, maybe you want to be attractive to women in some particular way. Maybe you want to think about what happened with the Jews, right? Stark has a very strong thesis of that mission to the Jews and why it succeeded. Are there lessons there that you could take? Like you could take from all over that book, right? Maybe during COVID, you want to be really helpful or something. Just wait for a plague to come around, right? I don't know. We just missed one. So, dang it. The movementarians are never going to make it. But right, you want to kind of, so you want to think, I'm being clever-ish with this question, right? What made Christianity as a new religious movement succeed? Or, we talked a lot about the Mormons, right? And Stark talks a lot about the Mormons and the Moonies and all of these things, right? What made those successful? We know this from that book and all we've talked about. So pick a couple of points and run with those and say, I would do this, right? And I would do this, right? Do you want to get rid of free riders? Like I said, there's a million ways you could go. This is a fun question to mark because it's fun to see what people come up with. I don't think anyone's ever come up with kill yourself, but it's a possibility. Okay, does that make sense? Like, this is what a question like this is asking you. It's like not really a case study. It's like, just think about like what lessons are there for new religious movements, or what do we know about how new religious movements succeed based on Stark's account in the rise of Christianity? Get Justin Trudeau to join your movement. That's probably not going to turn out, actually. Okay. So, and this one, right? Explain Bruce's view of secularization. So what does Bruce think, right? I just kind of went through it in, when someone asked a question, right? Late secularization, it set in later than we thought, every generation half as religious as the last, can't come back because of, these factors, right? Because it's alien, nobody knows anything about it, they're old, rural, Polish, all this stuff that Bruce talks about, right? There's been no religious revivals, so it's not likely, blah, 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 anything you want. What evidence does he give to support this view and to undermine the view of his opponents? All right, so in that, right, he gives a bunch of evidence, right? And particularly, so here you have to think, who's his opponent? I told you, right? Stark, right? They hate each other. What does Stark say? And there's 2 possibilities you go with. No secularization or self-limiting secularization, right? So then you got to think, all right, pick one. You don't necessarily have to go with both. What evidence does he give potentially against no secularization? That might be your 50% per generation decline, right? What does he give any evidence against, self-limiting secularization? This idea that it's going to bottom out and kind of rise again, right? Then you might be thinking declining stocks of knowledge and stuff like that. So that's how you would answer that question, right? You got to think again, and there's going to be questions. So you got to know how these are in conversation with each other, right? These theories of secularization, because while they are distinct theories in and of themselves, they're also yelling at each other constantly, right? And talking to each other, and addressing each other's ideas in particular ways. Hopefully I've done a good job of laying that out, because that's the kind of thing that's going to be the difference between, understanding those connections between the theories is going to be the thing that goes from like a 6 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10, right? Because it's the way they're speaking to each other that really matters here. Those are my 3 practice questions. Yeah, please.
For questions like these, should we focus on the core, the core aspects, and then, because for example, Bruce's theory is really big and it covers a whole crap ton of shit. So.
Right. So there's 2 parts of this, right? What's the outline of his theory, right? They're all big, right? Obviously they're all big and kind of deeply explanatory and using different facts. So explain what the theory is, right? His theory is it's setting late, right? And then it declines 50% per generation. And then all that evidence that he uses, right, all those arguments is all meant to address, say one of Stark's theories, right? Some of the criticisms that are coming either from like traditional religious people or from Rodney Stark and that kind of school. So you can explain the theory, right? What does he actually think? And then it's like, okay, is the evidence he's giving or the arguments he's making, are those core to the theory? Not really, but they're meant to address criticisms in those other theories of what he's thinking. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. That's the clearest map I can give you. I gave you the map, but I scribbled over it with Crayola crayons because I'm an eccentric person. All right. Any other questions? You can come talk to me after class or email me. My email is a bit of a disaster at the moment, but I will do my best to answer you in short order. And the exam will be the same as last time. You can do it at home. If you had accommodations, don't go to the accommodation center. Do it from your house. I'll give you all the extra time. All right. Namaste.